Frank, a 75-year-old former history professor, had been living alone for 10 years. After his wife passed away, his days became predictable. Morning tea, a walk in the park, some reading, and television. But there was one detail he never shared with anyone. He had developed a private habit that became part of his daily routine. Not because he was obsessed, but because it had become part of his routine. A kind of substitute for intimacy that had long been absent. He didn't think much of it until he began feeling fatigued, struggling with insomnia, and, worst of all, experiencing a strange sense of inner emptiness. When he finally came to see me, he looked healthy on the outside but seemed lost within. We talked for a long time, and at one point, he said, "I thought it was just an innocent habit, like brushing my teeth. But now, I'm not so sure." Moments like that remind me how deeply we underestimate the impact of the simplest actions on our lives. Over decades of practice, I've seen many men like Frank. They didn't come to me with obvious health complaints, but with questions they were too afraid to even articulate. Something felt wrong, not with the body, but with their sense of being alive. It wasn't a disease, not a specific pain, but a gradual fading of interest in themselves. It all started small, just relaxing before bed, and ended with a profound feeling of emotional depletion. That's when I realized private routines, even those considered harmless, can serve as either a form of emotional support or a way to disconnect from deeper issues. It all depends on the context and the mindset. The key is to understand why you're doing it and what you're actually getting from it. This isn't a question of morality, it's a question of awareness. There are 4 aspects men over 60 almost never discuss, even though they play a crucial role in their well-being, mood, and sense of masculinity. The first is emotional. The second, physiological. The third, anatomical. And the fourth, psychological. Each one can be understood and transformed, if approached with care. The sad part is that most men only realize this too late, when the consequences have already surfaced. But even then, as Frank's story shows, it's still possible to re-examine your habits and reclaim a sense of inner balance. And it can start with something simple: the desire to understand yourself. Frank came back a week later. He had read the materials I gave him and, for the first time in a long while, he started to reflect. Not on physiology, not on aging, but on why he was doing something that had become automatic for him. Sitting in the chair across from me, rubbing his hands, he said, "You know, doctor, I realized it's not just a habit. It's a pause. The only moment in the day when I feel something." He couldn't call it pleasure. Most of the time it was an attempt to disconnect, sometimes to escape anxiety, sometimes just to dull the sense of emptiness. That's when I shared with him the most important question one can ask. What is it that I actually want to feel? Not physically, but emotionally. Warmth? Acceptance? A living touch? The answer might be unexpected, but within it lies the real need. There were many like Frank. I remembered a man named John, a former sailor with a lifetime behind him. When he first told me about his habit, he looked away in shame. "I hope it's not abnormal at my age," he said. I replied, "It's not about age, John. It's about you. Why do you do it?" He fell silent. Then, almost in a whisper, he said, "Maybe because I don't feel anything anymore." Over time, many men lose the habit of listening to themselves. They were taught to be strong, reserved, decisive. But no one taught them to read the signals of the soul. Masturbation, especially in older age, may not be an act of pleasure, but a way to fill an emotional void. It's an attempt to regain a sense of control, meaning aliveness. When I gently suggested to Frank that he not give up the habit, but approach it with awareness, he was surprised. "I thought you'd tell me to stop." But that was the point. Not prohibition, but understanding. If the act becomes soulless, mechanical, it brings neither joy nor peace. But if it becomes a moment of self-care, without shame, without rush, then it gains meaning. Because when a person becomes aware of their true feelings, they are no longer ruled by them. They become an observer. And then even the most familiar act can become a step toward inner healing. Frank left the appointment in silence, but there was a new stillness in his eyes. Not emptiness, but the beginning of a conversation with himself. A month later, Frank came back noticeably more energized. He had started practicing what we talked about. Not so much changing his habits as becoming more attentive to himself. But now something else was bothering him. He admitted that in recent weeks he had been getting up more often at night to use the bathroom, feeling pressure in his lower abdomen, and during climax, a slight discomfort. There was anxiety in his voice. "Doctor, is this just age? Or am I doing something wrong?" I nodded. "Both, Frank, but let's start with the prostate. For most men, that word only comes to mind during an annual checkup. But the prostate isn't just a gland. It's the center of male health, connected not only to sexuality, but to overall well-being. And it doesn't like extremes. Neither long stagnation nor intense strain. Its enemy is irregularity and neglect. I explained that a healthy prostate needs rhythm. Regular balance in one's intimate life can support overall health, especially with age. No pressure, no guilt. Not because it's a duty, but because it's part of self-care. It helps clear the ducts, reduce inflammation, and remove waste. But that's not all. "Have you ever heard of the pelvic floor?" I asked. Frank frowned. He had no idea that men had one too. Most don't. Yet these deep muscles are responsible for the strength of erections, urine retention, and orgasm control. With age, especially with a sedentary lifestyle, these muscles weaken. That's when the small things appear. Leakage after urination, a weak tension in the lower belly, a vague sense that something is off, but hard to define. I told him about a simple exercise. Tighten the muscles as if trying to stop. Urination. Hold for 5 seconds, then release. Repeat 10 times. It can be done sitting, lying down, even standing in line. "Sounds like nonsense," Frank chuckled. "Try it," I said. 2 weeks later, he returned. "Doctor, you weren't kidding. I actually feel stronger, even a bit more confident. It's strange, but nice." I smiled. That was the point. Not miracles, but a return of control. A man's body changes with age. But that doesn't mean the end. It's an invitation to rethink, to recalibrate, to care. The prostate and pelvic floor are not enemies. They're allies. They've just been waiting to be heard. Frank had taken a long time to work up the courage to bring it up. He came in, as always, in a neatly pressed shirt, composed and polite, but his eyes showed tension. He waited until we finished discussing the physiological topics, and then, almost shyly, he said, "Doctor, I still haven't been able to tell my daughter that I have, well, intimate needs. I feel ashamed. I judge myself for it." That phrase struck me as heavier than any symptom. Frank wasn't ashamed of the habit itself, but of a deep-seated guilt that had built up over the years. Like many men of his generation, he grew up believing that real men don't talk about desires, especially those deemed inappropriate for their age. Shame became a quiet shadow they lived with. I told Frank about Walter, another patient, of mine. He had been married for 45 years, yet had masturbated in secret his whole life. Not because he didn't love his wife, but because he was afraid of being laughed at or rejected. When he finally gathered the courage to tell her, something unexpected happened. She didn't judge him. She hugged him and said, "All this time I thought you didn't want me anymore." Shame isn't just an emotion. It's a crack where intimacy disappears. Men begin to hide their desires, feelings, and needs. Not because they're wrong, but because they were once taught that speaking about them is weakness. But in truth, openness is what takes real strength. When Frank heard that story, he sat silently for a long time. Then he said, "Maybe I should try too. Just talk, without making excuses." I encouraged him, and I reminded him, true intimacy doesn't start with the body. It starts with honesty, with the moment you stop hiding and allow yourself to be real. A month later, he came back a different man. Not only had he talked to his daughter, but he also began a gentle yet sincere conversation with a woman he had been friends with for a couple of years. "Doctor, I never thought someone could actually hear me at this age, but it turns out they can, and it's freeing. The secret isn't in changing who you are. It's in no longer being afraid to be yourself. With age, we don't lose the right to feel. We finally begin to accept our feelings with dignity, and that reconnects us with ourselves and with those around us."